Hello, my name is Charles Dunn, and I am presenting on my internship with Aspen Developmental Services during the semester of spring 2025. So in order to get going, in order to find this internship, I ended up using Handshake, one of those school services that they provide in order to help people, students specifically, get in contact with employers. I found it a little bit more helpful than some of the other online resources such as Indeed or Google's job tool. Um, I sent a message actually via Handshake to the my soon-to-be boss, just asking a quick question about the application process to see because I had some interest in the job, but was not certain whether or not I wanted to take it or if there was a better option for me out there. I had a relatively straightforward interview, and was offered the position at the interview itself. Um, and I interviewed a month before beginning work. I, in fact, asked for a delay before starting work just so that I could finish my prior internship, with which they complied nicely. To give a brief overview of my responsibilities, I was a behavior intervention technician. And as part of that, I was required to undergo multiple trainings that involved something called RBT training, shadowing, and several various online trainings. To clarify, the RBT training stands for Registered Behavioral Technician, which is a 40-hour online training that simply prepared me to be able to use the principles or the techniques taught in the applied behavioral analysis or ABA behavioral intervention. Largely, it was talking about the various tools that one can use in order to reinforce good behaviors and help extinct undesirable behaviors that we see sometimes in the clients that we ended up serving. Um, a lot of what I ended up doing was that behavioral intervention and data collection. So I would work with my client on usually a lot of daily living tasks, sometimes homework, sometimes, personal chores, and then their social skills often, and just encourage and invite them to try again or to attempt to do one of those behaviors in a more functional or more appropriate way, or a way that would essentially lead to them having an easier time in the future. It was stressed to me very often that my responsibility was to my client. So above all things, they told me at Aspen Developmental that my first priority was my client's well-being above anything else while I was on the job. And that included parental requests or just anything that could come about. It was the safety and well-being of my client. In addition to working with my client, which took up the majority of my time, we had ongoing education as well. These involved mostly online trainings that I mentioned above. I ended up doing about 8 or 10 hours of online trainings for Aspen itself, in addition to the 40-hour online RBT training. In addition, I became a mandatory reporter. Fortunately, in the state of Idaho, it is mandatory for all adults who are aware of child abuse to report child abuse. However, I was given specific training on that, and it was generalized to, by the way, if you see this in any area of your life, you're required to report it. Um, Moving forward, how I benefited the site. My impact was largely on my client. So I worked with one child for the majority of my internship. One of the things that I feel like I generally provided for them was consistency in their life and unconditional positive regard. I was relatively consistent in the way that I treated them and tried to be as honest and clear as I could. It seemed oftentimes as though my client would struggle when it felt like they understood or were told one thing and another thing ended up happening. And so I tried to eliminate that in how I worked with them as much as I possibly could. In addition, I felt it was very helpful for them to get a lot of unconditional positive regard and attention and positive attention from an adult, as that was not always the case in their home life. Another place where I impacted my client was in their interactions with their sibling. This was something that one of their parents had mentioned, that my client and their sibling did not get along super well and that it caused a lot of distress at home. I was able to work with my client while they were interacting with their sibling and practice different methods of communication, and then try to help my client start looking at things a little bit differently in order to not immediately go to the fight or flight response when it felt like they were being attacked by their sibling, verbally or whatever may have been happening. In terms of how I benefited personally, this was actually a very difficult experience for me. There were many times, especially while I was working with my client at first, that I felt unqualified or incapable or incompetent, simply incapable of working with this child in a way that would benefit them for the better. Um, I was especially grateful, however, for how difficult it was. There were many things that I learned in addition to gaining some great work experience that I look forward to putting on my resume and then talking about in the future. I finally got to have a position in the human services rather than customer service work, which I had done previously. I learned to say no to people more confidently and naturally as my client made a lot of requests, as young children sometimes do, and some of those were simply not possible. Typically, I've been the kind of person in the past who would just try to make things work, and that would often lead to a lot of stress on my part. But with my client, I began to learn how to say no more confidently and more naturally. I was also extremely grateful for the preparation that I had from my BYU Idaho classes. It was awesome as I worked with some of these coworkers of mine who were master's students and above who were obviously I felt very unqualified next to them. But I felt prepared for the job, especially as I worked next to them. I had opportunities where I got to see that they did things differently and I got to learn from them. However, they also expressed learning from me from time to time, and I really appreciated that as it felt like I had been well prepared by my classes at BYU Idaho. The two primary connections I made to my coursework, these were just recurring throughout the semester. I made connections to my parenting class, primarily with the way of being. I took my parenting class with Brother Rarick, and one of the books that we read was The Anatomy of Peace. One of the biggest takeaways that I had from this class was the best way to parent is to be the best person that you can be prior to then trying to employ parenting techniques. Um, and so that played a role in my internship a lot this past semester, as there were moments where I was really struggling and trying to figure out how I could manage to actually do what I was trying to do with my client. And I did have to work on coming closer to God in order to be able to overcome some of those struggles. And that was a real lifesaver for me during the semester. Another class that I connected a lot with was child development. As I was working with children, it was awesome to be able to look through what I was learning in that class as I had the fortune to be taking child development during the same semester I was doing my internship. And I got to see and parallel things in my client's life and what I was learning in class. As far as a recommendation, I would not give an outright recommendation to this internship. There are a few cautions and a few benefits to it, and I'd like to point those out before. Um, so some of them were the inconsistency in the work experience and the dependency on my client's family. I struggled to get my hours oftentimes because I was dependent on my client's family, and sometimes they were traveling, or oftentimes they were traveling or doing activities that I did not feel comfortable joining them, even though I had been invited. Some of the other things that I struggled with were the expectations of my employer. It seemed like there was this unspoken expectation to spend my personal funds and to travel all over the place wherever need be without mileage reimbursement. I was commuting from Rexburg down to Idaho Falls anyway, and then was basically being asked to travel from South Idaho Falls to Rigby to Idaho Falls, and it was a little bit of a drain on my resources and time to be driving so much. Another caution was the disorganization and confusion with what was expected in the business. I sometimes struggled with how just understanding what was expected of me. My last caution was my personal feelings regarding behaviorism. I'm not a huge fan of some of B.F. Skinner's findings and some of B.F. Skinner's opinions. However, I did come to kind of a consensus where I was able to understand a little bit better how behaviorism can be used in conjunction with unconditional positive regard. One of the benefits was how rewarding it was when my client made progress. This was usually short-lived, but it was rewarding whenever I got to feel like I took part in something positive happening in my client's life and some of their personal growth. Another benefit was the flexibility in the schedule. So as I mentioned before, I don't recommend this internship except in cases where you'd be willing to deal with the consequences or the cautions that I offer. Here is the contact information for Matt Smith, who's the owner of the business and who I interviewed with. Thank you so much.